Let's now start with our top story. Afghanistan and Pakistan have stressed the need to further the cause of peace and stability in Afghanistan and beyond. This was said by the head of the High Council for Afghan Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah, after he met Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa in Kabul. Abdullah said the two sides called for taking necessary steps towards intra-Afghan negotiations. He hailed Pakistan's constructive role in the Afghan peace process. Earlier, General Bajwa held talks with the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani in Kabul and discussed bilateral issues and the Afghan peace process. The meeting comes as the Kabul administration and the Taliban are gearing up to start intra-Afghan talks as part of the Doha peace deal. Well, to discuss that a bit further, we're now joined with Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, who is an expert on Afghan issues. Mr. Yousafzai, thank you for joining us here on Indus News. What is the significance of this meeting, and what do you believe it is set out to achieve?
I think it is a very high-level engagement because it's not often that the Pakistan Army Chief and the ISI Chief go to Kabul. It has been a while that Afghan leaders have come to Pakistan. So it is, I think, very significant development. I think it has something to do with the visit of the Mir Khalilzad to Doha and Islamabad, and he also is supposed to go to Kabul. So I think an effort is being made by the U.S. with the cooperation of Pakistan to, number one, seal the peace accord signed between the U.S. and Taliban in Doha in February. Secondly, to expedite the intra-Afghan dialogue. And for that, they will have to remove some of the hurdles. One of the hurdles has been removed already internally by the Afghan leadership because Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah have reconciled, and they're going to share power, and Abdullah will lead the peace talks on the Afghan side. Secondly, which is more contentious, is the exchange of prisoners. And in that context, the real hurdle has been the Afghan government, which has been delaying the release of Taliban prisoners. And Taliban has said categorically they will not engage in intra-Afghan dialogue unless all their 5,000 prisoners are released.
Well, Mr. Yousafzai, Pakistan's role in facilitating the Afghan peace process has been repeatedly acknowledged and praised by the U.S. Now, with the intra-Afghan talks in Qatar apparently not far away, what more does the U.S. seek from Pakistan going forward?
I think the U.S. wants Pakistan to persuade the Taliban to either extend the ceasefire or reduce violence, as they did when they were signing the peace agreement with the U.S. They reduced violence for 1 week, and that actually led to the peace agreement on 29th of February. But Pakistan will be telling the Americans that they have to put pressure on the Ashraf Ghani government to release the Taliban prisoners as committed by the U.S. in the Doha peace agreement. So they will be trying to accomplish two tasks, and both have a responsibility to try to do that. I think the other issue is that all the other details, the timing of starting the intra-Afghan dialogue, the venue, the agent, they will have to be discussed. And I think in a way, Pakistan has been very helpful. But the strange thing is that Americans want Pakistan to become more involved in the peace process, while the Afghan government does not trust Pakistan, and they want minimum Pakistani engagement. So that has to be reconciled. I think that again will be the responsibility of the U.S. to tell the Afghan government that Pakistan is doing it sincerely and that it can be very useful. So that is now, I think, one of the reasons that the Afghan government is not very keen on Pakistani involvement. It believes Pakistan is interfering in the Afghan affairs.
Well, Mr. Yousafzai, we'll leave it there for now, but of course, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here at Indus News. Well, the Afghan government is now preparing for the first round of the intra-Afghan talks with the Taliban. The chief of the High Council for National Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah, says the talks are expected to be held in Qatar. Speaking in Kabul, Abdullah said the countries that have offered to facilitate the talks may host future rounds of the dialogue. Abdullah said the U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad is now speaking with Taliban delegates to finalize the details. Pakistan has appointed former diplomat Mohammad Sadiq as its special envoy for Afghanistan to step up its focus on the peace process. Islamabad has taken a strong exception to Indian Home Minister Amit Shah's statement regarding a surgical strike inside Pakistan. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said India would get a befitting response to any misadventure. In a statement, Qureshi said India must not remain in a fool's paradise and must remember how Pakistan reacted earlier. Qureshi said the international community should take notice of Delhi's desires to escalate the situation with Islamabad. He called on Amit Shah to elaborate what was stopping India from carrying out a surgical strike in Ladakh. The foreign minister said Delhi was trying to shift the blame of its failures onto Pakistan. Qureshi said the situation in occupied Kashmir was deteriorating by the day. In Brazil, 679 more people have died from COVID-19, with the tally crossing 37,000. The U.S. has recorded 477 deaths in the past 24 hours, taking the toll to nearly 111,000. Worldwide, the death count has crossed 406,000, while infections are over 7.1 million. More on that now in this report.
The number of global deaths and confirmed cases of the new coronavirus continues to soar, with no immunization in sight. But President Donald Trump is heading for a speedy reopening of the U.S. economy despite warnings of a second wave. The state of California says it can reopen cinemas by Friday if people follow guidelines to curb the spread of COVID-19. The World Health Organization has warned that the pandemic situation in Central and South America is the most complicated.
What we're seeing from Mexico all the way through to Chile is an increasing pattern across the Americas, across Latin America, with some notable exceptions. But I think this is a time of great concern. It's a time in which we need strong government leadership in Latin America.
While the debate over COVID-19 lockdowns continues, a study has revealed the lockdown saved more than 3 million lives in Europe. In Indonesia, Jakarta's governor Anies Baswedan said he is confident that coronavirus is under control to safely reopen the capital. Russia, too, has allowed people to resume international travel despite a surge in cases across the country.
A government decree was signed which will give Russian citizens the opportunity to leave the country to care for sick relatives living in other countries, as well as those traveling for work or study. It would also be possible for Russian citizens who need to get medical treatment abroad.
After New Zealand, Tanzania has also declared that the East African country is COVID-19 free. President John Magufuli attributed the claimed success to prayers and fasts that the citizens have offered to God.
Pakistan has reported its highest single-day death toll from the coronavirus, with 105 fatalities. This takes the tally to 2,172. The health ministry says the number of cases in the country has risen to more than 108,000 as 4,646 tested positive overnight. The ministry said 35,018 patients of coronavirus have recovered so far. Officials said the province of Punjab has reported over 40,000 cases, while Sindh has reported more than 39,000 cases. The U.S. has invited China to the latest round of nuclear talks between Washington and Moscow. In a tweet, U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy for arms control, Marshall Billingsley, said Washington expects Beijing to show up and negotiate in good faith. This comes as the decades-old nuclear arms agreement between Washington and Moscow, the New START Treaty, is set to expire in February. The Trump administration remains keen on involving China in the trilateral dialogue, despite Beijing's stated lack of interest. Earlier on Monday, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said the White House was obsessed with China. Russia and the U.S. are estimated to possess thousands of nuclear weapons. China is said to have the world's third largest nuclear arsenal with about 300 nukes. Hong Kong's Carrie Lam says the city cannot afford more chaos as activists have marked a year of sustained pro-democracy rallies with lunchtime protests. Lam said all stakeholders need to learn from mistakes as the territory had a difficult past year. The city is on alert with larger gatherings planned to mark the first anniversary of a mass rally that galvanized the pro-democracy movement. Last year, the proposed extradition law drew over 1 million protesters in a city of 7.5 million people. Lam later withdrew the bill, but it triggered months of often violent protests over concerns regarding the city's autonomy. Demonstrators have returned to the streets after Beijing proposed new national security laws, which activists fear will further undermine freedoms. Taiwan says it has warned off several Chinese Sukhoi 30 fighter jets that briefly entered its airspace. Defense Ministry said the jets drove away its intruders into its air defense identification zone to its southwest. China has never renounced the use of force to bring Taiwan under its control, which Beijing claims as its own. Beijing remains suspicious of Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen, accusing her of being pro-independence, an allegation that Tsai denies. Meanwhile, the U.S. has also ramped up its presence near the island with semi-regular Navy expeditions through the narrow Taiwan Strait. Washington remains Taipei's strongest supporter and main arms supplier, despite having no formal diplomatic ties. South Korea says it will continue to abide by the agreement with North Korea. This comes after Pyongyang did not answer a routine daily call to the Inter-Korean Liaison Office. South Korea's Ministry of Unification said the routine calls and military hotlines are basic means of communication between the neighboring countries. Seoul said it was the first time that the North has not answered military phone calls from the South since the hotlines were restored in 2018. Earlier, North Korea vowed to cut off all inter-Korean communication lines in anger over anti-Pyongyang leaflets sent from the South. North Korean defectors and anti-Pyongyang activists often send balloons carrying leaflets criticizing the communist regime and its leader. Tehran has sentenced an Iranian citizen to death for spying for U.S. intelligence services on the whereabouts of slain commander Qasem Soleimani. Iran's judiciary said Mahmoud Mousavi Majd also spied for Israel's Mossad. Officials have not said whether Mousavi Majd's case is linked to Iran's announcement of the capture of 17 CIA agents last summer. On January 3rd, a U.S. drone strike in Iraq killed Soleimani, who was the leader of Iran's Revolutionary Guards Quds Force. Washington blamed Soleimani for masterminding attacks by Iran-aligned militias on U.S. forces in the Middle East. Soleimani's killing led to a peak in the confrontation between Iran and the United States. U.S. sanctions on Iran's shipping network and its Chinese subsidiary have taken effect after they were announced in December. Washington has accused the shipping network of supporting proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has threatened curbs on anyone working with Iran's shipping lines and its Shanghai-based subsidiary E-Sail Shipping Company. He said any entities involved with the networks risk contributing to Iran's proliferation-sensitive programs. Pompeo has asked governments around the world to investigate activity by the shipping entities in their ports and seas. The State Department has accused IRISL of repeatedly transporting items related to Iran's ballistic missile and military programs. The Iraqi Revolutionary League claims it has shot down a U.S. military transport plane in Baghdad. The U.S. military spokesperson Miles Kaggans has denied that claim, saying the plane overshot the runway and crashed into a wall. Kaggans said 4 servicemen were injured in the crash with limited damage to the infrastructure and equipment. He said the incident was being investigated, but any enemy activity was not suspected. Meanwhile, the Iraqi military has confirmed that a rocket landed in the perimeter of Baghdad International Airport. The military said the rocket was launched from an area to the south of the airport, but there were no casualties. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan says he's discussed the conflict in Libya with U.S. President Donald Trump in a phone call. In an interview, Erdogan said a new era between Ankara and Washington may start after this discussion. The Turkish president said a new era can begin in bilateral relations on the transition process in Libya. Erdogan said he would speak with the Russian President Vladimir Putin about Moscow's claims that it does not have any soldiers in Libya. He alleged that Moscow has warplanes in Libya and Ankara will plan further after its conversation with Putin. A White House statement has said the two leaders also discussed Syria and the wider eastern Mediterranean region. Well, in the U.S., thousands have braved the sweltering heat to bid farewell to George Floyd, whose death in custody ignited worldwide protests against systemic racism and police brutality. Demonstrations have continued for the 14th day as demands to defund or abolish police departments have gathered force. In Minneapolis, a judge raised former Minnesota cop Derek Chauvin's bail to $1.25 million, with his second court appearance scheduled for June 29th. Elsewhere in Washington, congressional Democrats have introduced sweeping legislation to reform and restrain the under-fire police department. The legislation proposes to make lynching a federal hate crime and to allow for the public to sue law enforcement for damages, ending the legal doctrine of qualified immunity. The bill will also ban chokeholds, necessitate body cameras, restrict the use of lethal force, and facilitate independent probes of police misconduct. Meanwhile, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frade has echoed U.S. President Donald Trump's rejection to defund the police.
In the department, a big part of seeing that culture shift through is being able to both discipline as well as terminate individuals who have had some form of wrongful conduct. That needs to happen. And so if the question is, if we're reimagining entirely what the Minneapolis Police Department looks like, I am entirely in favor of it. However, as I've mentioned previously, I'm not for abolition of the police department.
In Kenya, protesters have staged a demonstration against police brutality, demanding justice for victims of extrajudicial killings. This comes after a police watchdog said officers were involved in the killing of at least 15 people since a coronavirus curfew was imposed in late March. The crowd in Nairobi included youth and mothers who carried signs with the names of people killed in police operations in recent years. Others held placards reading slogans like "Our life is priceless," "Save our future," and "Never again." Protesters concluded their demonstration at Moyo's house, calling for reforms. Turkey says it has killed 4 militants of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. The Interior Ministry said the terrorists were killed in southeastern Sirnak and eastern Tunceli provinces. The ministry said Turkey would continue to destroy weapon caches and shelters used by terrorists. It said the operations are ongoing in the region. The raids come after 2 Turkish workers were killed and 8 others were wounded in an improvised explosive device blast in Van province. The province's governor, Mehmet Bilmez, said the roadside bomb was planted by the PKK. Russia says it will take up to 5 days to eliminate the consequences of an oil spill at the field in the Nenets Autonomous District. The press service of the regional government said the spill has a water content of 90% with a contamination area of 50 square meters. The government said such a quantity is not assigned to municipal, regional, or federal categories. It said the well has been closed in and the oil company is taking measures to clean the territory and perform remedial work. Earlier, Russia's Ministry of Emergency said 10 tons of oil products were spilled in Nenets district. The incident occurred at an oil field owned by OOO Polar Light Company. An airliner carrying Iran's humanitarian aid in context of COVID-19 has landed at Caracas airport. Iran's ambassador to Venezuela, Hujjatullah Sultani, said the assistance will strengthen Venezuela's response to the pandemic. This follows a relentless U.S. sanctions program against Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro in order to oust him from power. Sultani said Tehran, Caracas, and other revolutionary nations should unite against Washington. I'll be back after this. Saudi Arabia says Iraq has pledged to cut its oil output steeper than its OPEC quota of July to September. In a news conference, the Saudi Energy Minister, Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, said Baghdad failed to deliver on pledged cuts from May to June. The minister did not say what would happen if Iraq fails to deliver on its promises from July onwards. He added that Riyadh would boost output in July while ending voluntary deeper cuts amid signs of a global demand recovery. Norway's oil ministry said it has no plans to modify its existing plans for production cuts following the OPEC Plus agreement. The American National Bureau of Economic Research has officially declared that the U.S. has entered an economic recession. The ruling puts a formal end to what had been more than a decade of economic expansion, the longest in U.S. history. The U.S. economy contracted 5% in the first quarter of the year as the country deals with the COVID-19 fallout. In a statement, NBER said an unprecedented decline in employment and production warrants this designation. The Bureau typically defines a recession as an economic contraction that lasts for more than a few months. It has declared 12 recessions since 1948, the longest of which was the Great Recession, which lasted 18 months, from December 2007 to June 2009. The World Bank says the coronavirus will cause global economic output to contract by 5.2% in 2020. In its latest report, the World Bank said that advanced economies are expected to shrink by 7.5%. It further said that the emerging market economies will contract by 2.5%. On a per capita GDP basis, the global contraction will be the deepest since 1945-46. The updated forecasts show more damage to the economy than estimates released in April by the IMF. World Bank officials said their scenario assumes that lockdowns and temporary business closures begin to ease at the end of June. European stocks have edged lower as investors weigh the prospects of economic recovery after the coronavirus pandemic. Investors continue to tread cautiously as major economies have already entered recessions. Frankfurt's DAX is trading over 2% lower after Germany's industrial output plunged by a record 18% month-on-month in April. The CAC 40 in Paris has lost nearly 2%. London's FTSE 100 is trading over 1.5% lower as British American Tobacco fell about 3%. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index gained over 1%, while the Shanghai Composite closed over 0.5% higher. The Nikkei 225 lost nearly 0.5% after Japan's economy officially entered a technical recession. The international benchmark Brent crude oil price has lost. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. For the latest updates on these and other stories, you can always follow us on our social media at Indus.news. Thanks for watching.